goes with the realities that we live each and every day. In your first century, this organization stood up to lynching, Jim Crow, and segregation, helped to shepherd a Civil Rights Act, a Voting Rights Act. I would not be here, and so many others would not be here without the NAACP. In your second century, we've worked together to give more of our children a shot at a quality education, to help more families rise up out of poverty, to protect future generations from environmental damage, to create fair housing, to help more workers find the purpose of a good job. And together we've made real progress, including a My Brother's Keeper initiative to give more young people a fair shot in life, including the passage of a law that declares health care is not a privilege for the few. We made progress, but our work is not done. By just about every measure, life chances for Black and Hispanic youth still lag far behind those of their white peers. Our kids, America's children, so often are isolated, without hope, less likely to graduate from high school, less likely to earn a college degree, less likely to be employed, less likely to have health insurance, less likely to own a home. Part of this is a legacy of hundreds of years of slavery, segregation, and structural inequalities that compounded over generations. It did not happen by accident. Partly as a result of continuing and sometimes more subtle bigotry. Whether in who gets called back for a job interview, or who gets suspended from school, or what neighborhood you're able to rent an apartment in, which, by the way, is why our recent initiative to strengthen the awareness and effectiveness of fair housing laws is so important. So we can't be satisfied, are not satisfied, until the opportunity gap is closed for everybody in America. Everybody. But today I want to focus on one aspect of American life that remains particularly skewed by race and by wealth, a source of inequity that has ripple effects on families and on communities and ultimately on our nation. And that is our criminal justice system. This is not a new topic. I know sometimes folks discover these things like they just happen. There's a long history of inequity in the criminal justice system in America. When I was in the state legislature in Illinois, we worked to make sure that we had videotaping of interrogations because there were some problems there. We set up racial profiling laws to prevent the kind of bias in traffic stops that too many people experience. Since my first campaign, I've talked about how in too many cases our criminal justice system ends up being a pipeline from underfunded, inadequate schools to overcrowded jails. What has changed, though, is that in recent years, the eyes of more Americans have been opened to this truth. Partly because of cameras, partly because of tragedy, partly because the statistics cannot be ignored. We can't close our eyes anymore. And the good news, and this is truly good news, is that good people of all political persuasions are starting to think we need to do something about this. So let's look at the statistics. The United States is home to 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners. Think about that. Our incarceration rate is 4 times higher than China's. We keep more people behind bars than the top 35 European countries combined. And it hasn't always been the case, this huge explosion in incarceration rates. In 1980, there were 500,000 people behind bars in America. 500,000 people in 1980. I was in college in 1980. Many of you were not born in 1980, that's okay. I remember 1980, 500,000. Today, there are 2.2 million. It has quadrupled since 1980. Our prison population has doubled in the last 2 decades alone. Now, we need to be honest. There are a lot of folks who belong in prison. If we're gonna deal with this problem and the inequities involved, then we also have to speak honestly. There are some folks who need to be in jail. They may have had terrible things happen to them in their lives. We hold out the hope for redemption, but they've done some bad things. Murderers, predators, rapists, gang leaders, drug kingpins. We need some of those folks behind bars. Our communities are safer thanks to brave police officers and hardworking prosecutors who put those violent criminals in jail. And the studies show that up to a certain point, tougher prosecutors and stiffer sentences for these violent offenders contributed to the decline in violent crime over the last few decades. Although the science also indicates that you get a point of diminishing returns. But it is important for us to recognize that violence in our communities is serious, and that historically, in fact, the African American community oftentimes was under-policed rather than over-policed. Folks were very interested in containing the African American community so it couldn't leave segregated areas, but within those areas, there wasn't enough police presence. But here's the thing. Over the last few decades, we've also locked up more and more nonviolent drug offenders than ever before for longer than ever before. And that is the real reason our prison population is so high. In far too many cases, the punishment simply does not fit the crime. If you're a low-level drug dealer or you violate your parole, you owe some debt to society. You have to be held accountable and make amends. But you don't owe 20 years. You don't owe a life sentence. That's disproportionate to the price that should be paid. And by the way, the taxpayers are picking up the tab for that price. Every year we spend $80 billion to keep folks incarcerated. $80 billion. Now just to put that in perspective, for $80 billion we could have universal preschool for every 3-year-old and 4-year-old in America. That's what $80 billion buys. For $80 billion we could double the salary of every high school teacher in America. For $80 billion, we could finance new roads, new bridges, new airports, job training programs, research and development. We're about to get into a big budget debate in Washington. What I couldn't do with $80 billion. It's a lot of money. For what we spend to keep everyone locked up for 1 year, we could eliminate tuition at every single one of our public colleges. As Republican Senator and presidential candidate Rand Paul has said. No, and to his credit, he's been consistent on this issue. Imprisoning large numbers of nonviolent drug offenders for long periods of time costs the taxpayers money without making them any safer.
That's the truth.
Roughly 1/3 of the Justice Department's budget now goes toward incarceration. 1/3. And there are outstanding public servants at our Justice Department, starting with our outstanding Attorney General, Loretta Lynch. And they do outstanding work, so many of them. But every dollar they have to spend keeping nonviolent drug offenders in prison is a dollar they can't spend going after drug kingpins, or tracking down terrorists, or hiring more police, and giving them the resources that would allow them to do a more effective job of community policing. And then, of course, there are the costs that can be measured in dollars and cents. Because the statistics on who gets incarcerated show that by a wide margin, it disproportionately impacts communities of color. African Americans and Latinos make up 30% of our population. They make up 60% of our inmates. About 1 in every 35 African American men, 1 in every 88 Latino men is serving time right now. Among white men, that number is 1 in 214. Bottom line is that in too many places, black boys and black men, Latino boys and Latino men, experience being treated differently under the law. And I want to be clear, this is not just anecdote. This is not just barbershop talk. A growing body of research shows that people of color are more likely to be stopped, frisked, questioned, charged, detained. African Americans are more likely to be arrested. They are more likely to be sentenced to more time for the same crime. And one of the consequences of this is around 1 million fathers are behind bars. Around 1 in 9 African American kids has a parent in prison. What is that doing to our communities? What's that doing to those children? Our nation's being robbed of men and women who could be workers and taxpayers, could be more actively involved in their children's lives, could be role models, could be community leaders. And right now they're locked up for a nonviolent offense. So our criminal justice system isn't as smart as it should be. It's not keeping us as safe as it should be. It is not as fair as it should be. Mass incarceration makes our country worse off, and we need to do something about it. But here's the good news. Good news. Don't get me preaching. I am feeling more hopeful today because even now, well, let's face it, it seems like Republicans and Democrats cannot agree on anything. A lot of them agree on this. In fact, today back in Washington, Republican senators from Utah and Texas are joining Democratic senators from New Jersey and Rhode Island to talk about how Congress can pass meaningful criminal justice reform this year. That is good news. Good news. That doesn't happen very often. And it's not just senators. This is a cause that's bringing people in both the houses of Congress together. It's created some unlikely bedfellows. You've got Van Jones and Newt Gingrich. You've got Americans for Tax Reform and the ACLU. You've got the NAACP and the Koch brothers. Oh, you got to give them credit. You got to call it like you see it. There are states from Texas and South Carolina to California and Connecticut who've acted to reduce their prison populations over the last 5 years and seen their crime rates fall. That's good news. My administration has taken steps on our own to reduce our federal prison population. So I signed a bill reducing the 101 sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine. I commuted the sentences of dozens of people sentenced under old drug laws that we now recognize were unfair. And yesterday I announced that I'm commuting dozens more. Under the leadership of Attorney General Eric Holder, now continued by Loretta Lynch, federal prosecutors got what he called smart on crime, which is refocusing efforts on the worst offenders, pursuing mandatory minimum sentences 20% less often than they did the year before. The idea is you don't always have to charge the max. To be a good prosecutor, you need to be proportionate. And it turns out that we're solving just as many cases, there are just as many plea bargains. It's working, it's just that we've eliminated some of the excess. And recently something extraordinary happened. For the first time in 40 years, America's crime rate and incarceration rate both went down at the same time. That happened last year. There's some momentum building for reform. There's evidence mounting for why we need reform. And I want to spend the rest of my time just laying out some basic principles, some simple ideas for what reform should look like, because we're just at the beginning of this process and we need to make sure that we stay with it. And I'm going to focus on what happens in three places: in the community, in the courtroom, and in the cell block. Wow. So I want to begin with the community because I believe crime is like any other epidemic. The best time to stop it is before it starts. And I'm going to go ahead and say what I've said 100 times before or 1,000 times before and what you've heard me say before. if we make investments early in our children, we will reduce the need to incarcerate those kids. So, one study found that for every dollar we invest in pre-K, save at least twice that down the road and reduce crime. Getting a teenager a job for the summer costs a fraction of what it costs to lock him up for 15 years. Investing in our communities makes sense. It saves taxpayer money if we are consistent about it. And if we recognize that every child deserves opportunity, not just some, not just our own. What doesn't make sense is treating entire neighborhoods as little more than danger zones, where we just surround them. We ask police to go in there and do the tough job of trying to contain the hopelessness when we are not willing to make the investments to help lift those communities out of hopelessness. That's not just a police problem, that's a societal problem. Places like West Philly, or West Baltimore, or Ferguson, Missouri, they're part of America too. They're not separate. They're part of America like anywhere else. The kids there are American kids.
That's right.
It's like your kids and my kids.
That's right.
So we got to make sure boys and girls in those communities are loved and cherished and supported and nurtured and invested in. And we have to have the same standards for those children as we have for our own children. So, if you are a parent, you know that there are times where boys and girls are going to act out in school.
That's right.
And the question is, are we letting principals and parents deal with one set of kids and we call the police on another set of kids? That's not the right thing to do. We've got to make sure our juvenile justice system remembers that kids are different. Don't just tag them as future criminals. Reach out to them as future citizens. And even as we recognize that police officers do one of the toughest, bravest jobs around, and we do everything in our power. And as we do everything in our power to keep those police officers safe on the job, I've talked about this. We have to restore trust between our police and some of the communities where they serve. And a good place to start is making sure communities around the country adopt the recommendations from the task force I set up that included law enforcement, but also included young people from New York and from Ferguson. And they were able to arrive at a consensus around things like better training, better data collection, to make sure that policing is more effective and more accountable, but is also more unbiased. So these are steps in the community that will lead to fewer folks being arrested in the first place. Now, they won't eliminate crime entirely. There's going to be crime. And that's why the second place we need to change is in the courtroom. For non-violent drug crimes, we need to lower long mandatory minimum sentences or get rid of them entirely. The crime suppression around non-violent crimes so that potentially we can steer a young person who's made a mistake in a better direction.